We have Mark Price from the Managing Director of Waitrose and Deputy Chairman of John Lewis Partnership, who's going to kick off with a really quite interesting speech on his views on capitalism and the JLP partnership. Over to you, Mark. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ashley. What I wanted to do was really begin by excusing all that I'm going to say, by saying that we all have unique perceptions of the world. This is a rather good cartoon from Bob, which shows Obama's view of the world, with David What's-his name over England, dangerous warmongering oil hoggers over Russia. And this is the same world from Putin's point of view, with deluded capitalist dogs over America, American puppets over Europe, and over Russia, mankind's only hope, me. So my views, I'm afraid, are deeply coloured by my upbringing and what I've done. And so I was born in Crewe, I was brought up in Crewe. My father twice set up his own small business. From the very earliest age I can remember working with him and working for him. On a Sunday he was a preacher, so I used to go to church 3 times on a Sunday. And he taught me some invaluable lessons. He taught me that everybody is equal in the eyes of God. He taught me that there is no profit in prejudice. And he taught me that if you rip people off, you will only get short-term gain. I then went to university, and I was very influenced by reading archaeology and ancient history, which gave me a feel for learning from the past and also an analytical approach. And then for the last 33 years, I've been in the John Lewis Partnership, and for the last 9 years, I've been running Waitrose. So clearly that colours my views, and I hope that you'll take that into account when you hear my speech this afternoon. The first thing that I want to do is just to show you these statistics. Now, these statistics come from Gallup. They're collected on an annual basis, and they are statistics from their survey of employee engagement. And what the statistics show is that in those companies with the most engaged employees, productivity is 20% better, shrinkage is 28% lower, defects are 41% lower, earnings per share are 147% higher, and a 5% increase in total employee engagement equates to a 7% increase in operating margin. Pretty compelling reasons, I think, to have really engaged employees. But imagine if, in addition to that, having engaged employees had a very positive impact on society as a whole. Now, none of us can have escaped some of the things that have been said about capitalism and capitalism failing since the bank crisis of 2008. Both political commentators and also business commentators. And I just want to read you 3 quotes and extracts to reinforce the point. The first is from Hillary Clinton on the presidential campaign trail, and she declared that capitalism is failing in a really strongly worded message. What she said was, Wall Street has hijacked corporate America. Shareholders' incessant greed for short-term profits is sucking business dry and robbing it of much-needed long-term investment. Businesses are no longer spending money on re-equipping, research, training, and innovation. Now, you might expect that. But closer to home, I don't know how many of you heard Andy Haldane's interview on Newsnight. He's the chief economist of the Bank of England. But he was equally robust, talking about our own economy. And he said a company which a generation ago had, say, £10 of cash would have paid out £1 to shareholders and reinvested £9 for the future. Today, they pay out £6 and retain £4. You don't need to be an economic expert to understand that this is unsustainable in the long term. And then only a few weeks ago, the veteran business leader of Lloyd's, John Nelson, who was mentioned earlier, now in his 50th year in the city, used a speech to say that there was a substantial trust deficit in business, and that had serious implications, not just for the city, but for society as a whole. And what he advocated was some quite structural changes in the way that business behaves. Now, for me, the Occupy movement outside St. Paul's in October 2011 struck a chord. I don't know if many of you or any of you did this, but I actually went to look at what was going on. And what was really striking is that people camped outside for 5 months were not the kind of protesters that you normally see rioting outside G7 summits. These were pretty normal people from Bury and Birmingham and Bolton who felt in some way that the current system wasn't working. And it was difficult for anybody really to know how to respond at that time. And the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, said, "Occupy reflects a deep-seated sense that there is something wrong, and we need to think very hard about what that is." So based on the back of that, what we've done is some survey work to see how customers in general feel about business. And I'm afraid that the findings make pretty sobering reason. So, 51% believe business only cares about money and nothing else. 56% say that business culture is dominated by greed and selfishness. 66% see business putting profit before the environment. And 61% agree staff are seen as a resource rather than as human beings. Big business, I'm afraid, comes in for most of the criticism, and just over half of the group surveys suggest that they have no respect for large companies. But for those of you here from SMEs, the good news is that 96% said that they thought that SME companies were good. So that presents a telling disconnect. So, on the top row, what you see is the order in which people think business actually puts its interest. First, you have the executives, and then the shareholders, then the customers, and last of all, employees and local companies. And then if you ask them how should business behave, you'll see there is a very different picture. They think that the customer and the employee should be at the top and the directors towards the bottom. The message, I'm afraid, is startlingly clear that people trust business less now than they have in the past. So, is business's drive to maximise shareholder value the real issue? At every business school that I've been to, what we are taught is the supreme purpose of the directors and the CEO is to maximise shareholder value. That's our reason for being. But somebody had a very different view of the world almost 100 years ago, and that's John Speed Lewis. Conditions when he was in the family business in the 1920s were not dissimilar to the conditions we faced over recent time. At the end of the First World War, there was a huge amount of economic unrest and upheaval, which led to the Great Depression. John Lewis, his father, set up John Lewis Oxford Street in 1864, and he and his brother joined the business. Now, shortly towards the end of the First World War, John Speed Lewis had a horse riding accident, and he took 6 months off work to convalesce. And in that time, it struck him that his pay, his father's pay and his brother's pay, totaled more than all the other people that worked inside John Lewis at the time. And he felt deeply uncomfortable about that. He also went to visit a number of the workers in their home who were also off sick and convalescing, and he was pretty unimpressed by the conditions in which they were living in. And so he resolved then that he would do something different. But it wasn't until his father died in 1928 that he put the shares of the company into trust for all of the workers. Now, that was pretty unusual in and of itself. But the thing that makes John Speed and Lewis so unusual is that what he said is that the purpose of the John Lewis Partnership is the happiness of all of the people that work in it. There are only two other places that I know of in the world that have happiness as the goal of an organisation. The first is the American Constitution, which talks about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the other is the King of Bhutan, who wishes happiness on all of his subjects. But what was quite remarkable about what Speed and Lewis did is that he realised that if your employees are engaged, you will have a more committed workforce. It's no surprise, therefore, that staff turnover in Waitrose is about a quarter of the industry. Sick absence in Waitrose is about a quarter of the industry. There is greater longevity when you visit a Waitrose. You'll see lots of people with 25-year badges on. And happier employees suffer less stress in the workplace. That leads to happier customers, better service, because your customers are happier and stay with you for longer. Then you get sustainable and growing profits. And if you want the academic justification for that, there's a very good Harvard Business Review paper published in 1994 called Putting the Service Profit Chain to Work. And what that paper successfully argues from American companies is those that put their employees first and their engagement first drive better customer service and drive better long-term profitability. So there are many companies now who are starting to embrace employee ownership. There are 100 of them in the UK. Some of them you will have heard of, Blackwell Bookshops, Wilkie & Sons, Scott Barder, to name but three. But when I talk to people about employee engagement, what they say is, I don't want to give my company away. Or we've already got our company in the hands of other shareholders. We can't do this. And so the model, I think, is ruled out very quickly. But I think there are elements of what the partnership does that can be implemented into any business. It's about what do you do to engage your workforce so that they deliver the most, so that you can grow the most. And I think that there are 6 things which the partnership does. Now, I'm afraid I haven't got long on any of these. I'm pleased to say I have written a book on these, which comes out in May, which I'm very grateful to the Telegraph for serialising in May. So if you want to have more detail, you can look at the book then. But just to skip through the 6 things which really mark out the partnership's approach. The first is reward and recognition. Now, what we expect is that pay really isn't a motivator. What we know is that pay will diminish people's dissatisfaction. In and of itself, it will not motivate for the long term. But what the partnership does is it rewards people for their performance. Unlike others, we do not have one spot rate. So when people look at what's happening with the national living wage and our competitors say it's £7.31, the pay ranges in Waitrose go from whatever we'll pay as a starting rate to 30% higher. And that's because we think individuals should be rewarded for their performance. That means that we have to have a very well-defined system for monitoring performance, and then a fair system to distribute pay. Secondly, we recognise that people should share in some of the benefits and the profits of the business. So you'll all know that we share out a bonus annually. And the other thing which is quite remarkable, which the founder believed, was that if you do own a business, you get to share the benefits of being an owner. So if you have a passion for sailing, you go and sail. If you have a passion for shooting, you go and shoot. So you won't be surprised to hear that the partnership has 5 ocean-going yachts, 5 country houses, and owns 2 golf courses, so that people working in the business can share those kind of benefits that a successful owner would share. The second is information. We think that sharing information is the most important thing to do if you are going to engage your employees. I once had a conversation with Charles Dunstan, who said to me, if I could do anything at Carphone Warehouse, what I'd love to do is to share our weekly figures with all of the staff in the business, but I can't do it. I'm quoted, and it will create too much volatility and fluctuation in the share price. I think that for us, sharing information routinely is a very, very powerful way of getting the workforce to understand what's going on and to engage in the changes that we need to make. It gives them power over what happens in the business. The third is empowerment. We do a number of things to make sure that we trust partners in the business to do the best they can. I'm a great decentralist. A number of years ago, we had a big and a growing customer call centre in Waitrose. But because of that, what was happening was that customers were phoning the call centre, which was removed from the shop, not the shop where they had the experience that they wanted to talk about. And so we restricted calls to the customer service centre to just.com, and we made sure that all calls were rerouted back to the branch and back to the partners who'd served the customers. We trusted them to do the right thing for our customers. We think that if you own something, you care more. And this really struck me recently. I live in a small village in North Dorset, and there was a chap that I used to bump into in the town who worked for CityLink. And very sadly, when that business went bust, he lost his job. But he decided that he was going to set himself up in business as a delivery driver. And not too long after he'd started up, I saw him and I said, is there much difference between owning your own business and working for CityLink? And he said, there's a huge difference. He said, when I worked for CityLink, he said, I didn't care about the van. He said, I trashed it. I just wanted to get around as quick as I could. I knew that every year it would be changed. I did the absolute minimum. He said, but I've bought the van now, and I know if I look after it and I drive it carefully, it will last twice as long. I make sure that I wash it every night when I get home. I make sure I do oil and water checks every week, because I want that van to last. He said, I hated the uniform that CityLink gave me. It was an awful polo shirt. It was terrible. He said, now I put a shirt on every day, I put a tie on every day, no doubt from Charles, and I make a point of looking really, really sharp for our customers. And he said, the other thing that I do, I'm not driven now by 9 to 5. I don't care about getting in on time and leaving on time. I'll put in the time that's needed to do the job. And if you can make your employees feel as though they own, they will deliver so much more. And that, for me, is the great strength of the John Lewis Partnership. 93,000 people feeling like owners and caring about the results. Well-being. There's a great quote from Theodore Roosevelt who said, nobody cares how much you know unless they know how much you care. And there are numerous examples that I could give you, but I don't have time to give you, of Deloitte's, of Unilever, in Waitrose and others, where the physical, mental and financial health of the workforce is prioritised so that they know that you care about them. Worthwhile, people having a sense of pride. One of the saddest statistics that I've read of late was that only 20% of people think or have a pride in the organisation that they work for. And only 22% think that the organisation they work for cares about society. And that can't lead to engaged and satisfied employees. So thinking about what you do so that your employees, or partners in our case, have a sense of pride is hugely important. And the last is satisfying, that people feel satisfied at work. Key in this probably won't surprise anybody in the room, but it's the relationship you have with your line manager. That it's absolutely vital. If you don't have a good relationship with your line manager, irrespective of how great the business is, irrespective of how great the brand is, you will go. Trust, respect, and development are also key to make sure that employees are really satisfied. I suspect for all of you, or for many of you, these things seem incredibly obvious, but there is a huge gulf between those businesses that do it incredibly well and those that don't prioritise this. They don't measure this. This is not a KPI for management. The KPI is about sales. The KPI is about profit. But if you get this right, if you measure this, if you make your employees the focus, they will deliver in the ways that I've talked about. They will give you 20% more productivity. They will give you less shrinkage. They will give you fewer defects. And they will give you better operating margin. But as well as all of those things, what they do is they create, to my mind, a fairer society. A society which is inclusive. Because people who work inside a business want to do the right thing by the communities they live in. In Waitrose, they want to do community matters. They want to give back to local good causes. The business is more sustainable. I particularly enjoyed the hare and the tortoise analogy. Waitrose is a tortoise. The John Lewis Partnership is a tortoise. We've been around for 150 years. Responsible, and lastly, profitable. I think this is all about evolution. I'm not a great believer in revolution. But I think that if in every day in our business we can do a little bit more to make our partners feel equipped for the jobs they're doing and looked after and satisfied, and that's a real challenge when you've got 93,000 now inside the partnership, we will grow in a sustainable way and benefit communities. And to end, a final quote from Speed and Lewis. And he said, "The partnership was created wholly and solely to make the world a bit happier and a bit more decent." Thank you very much.
It's quite unusual for a business leader to basically say capitalism is failing now. And I just wondered, you said that when you have spoken to other business leaders before, they balked at it, saying, well, we can't do it. But do you think now that you've given them black and white numbers, saying, well, you're going to have less shrinkage, you're going to have less sick days, you're going to have this, boost in earnings per share, that's what is going to hopefully drive this push?
Well, I think there are two things in that. The first one, I talk about capitalism is failing. I think that we should all be sitting back and asking questions about why we have got some of the issues that we've got, and to what extent is unconstrained capitalism responsible, and is there a fairer and a better way? There are a lot of people, and I understand the argument, that will say, look, our job is to create jobs, to pay wages, to make profits, to pay the government, that's enough. And I do think that that's going an awful long way. But what I've talked about in recent years is a different kind of contract between business and government. For me, it's about business providing the conditions, for government providing the conditions for business to thrive. So what they've done on corporation tax, what they've done on employee ownership, and giving us a level playing field on employee ownership, they are all wonderful things. But in exchange, I think that business has a responsibility. If I'd have had a lot more time, if people could have stood listening for much longer, I would have talked around health. The John Lewis Partnership for a very long time has had GPs in its business. It has physiotherapists. It has chiropodists who visit the branches. And that may seem very, very, very philanthropic. But the benefit for us is it keeps people at work. It keeps people healthy. But also, it releases some of the pressure on the National Health Service. And I think there are a number of ways in which business can be more socially responsible, and there are real commercial benefits in doing it. So I hope by using those statistics and other things that I talk about on occasion, people can see that it's not just fluffy. There are real benefits in engaging employees and thinking more about the long term and being responsible.
I mean, especially the cost of sickness, I know has been something that you've talked about as well. I mean, a huge burden for business. Other points about kind of increasing, you know, people's loyalty to the business. You yourself have been there for 33 years. You see a lot of 25-year-old badges there, but, you know, we've learnt shortly that you're going to be moving on. But 33 years, that's still quite some innings for a company. Just wondered why you thought now was the right time.
Well, I know I don't look it, but I'm 55 next year. And next year is my 10th year leading Waitrose. And I think you have to get to a point when you say, you know, that's a long time. I have great respect for a number of the earlier speakers who said that they've been in it for even longer. But for me, 33 years, 55, I can retire from the partnership in March. I get to still fish on the test. I still get my partnership discount card. I've got a brilliant successor in Rob Collins and a team that are 10 years younger than me and are now ready to go. They're ready to run the business and take it on to the next level. The reality is you're only the steward of a business for a period of time. What you hope is that in your time, you build the business and you leave something that's stronger than you inherited. And I'm sure that Rob will do that with his team for the next decade. Yeah. But it feels the right time for a whole number of reasons.
Yeah, well, you'll definitely have a badge.
Yeah.
I'll open the floor to a few questions now, because I'm sure that there's quite a few interested people.
What advice would you give to Marks and Spencer?
I don't know. I think Mark Bolland is a very capable operator. So obviously I was in Waitrose when Mark was in Morrison's. He's got a good pedigree. The world of retailing is changing quite fundamentally, and there are no easy solutions. I mean, that's what I would say. People look for quick fixes. Again, if I had time, I would have talked about the short-termism of the current system that we have. And I think that is one of the failings of the current system, that every quarter you've got to stand up, and based on that quarter of results, you know, people are judged and moved on. If you look at the average tenure of a CEO now, it's 4.5 years. In America, it's dropped to 3 years. And all of that thinking about short-termism, I think, is very, very unhelpful, particularly when you get the changes that we're seeing in retailing. In food, structural deflation created by now the size and the scale of German discounters, a move online growing at 20% a year, 5% of turnover at the moment, likely to be 10% of turnover in about 5 years' time. And you're seeing people eating out more and people using convenience shops more. These are massive structural changes. And if you've got a large estate of shops, which you have built over the previous 50, 60, 70, 100 years, it's very difficult to turn that tanker around. So I'm not critical of Mark or Dave Lewis or any of them. I know what a really tough job they have. From a Waitrose perspective, what I'm delighted to say is that we recognised a number of years ago that these were big structural changes that were going to affect us. We saw the discounters were going to grow. It's why we introduced Essential Waitrose and a number of things that we've done. It's why we did My Waitrose and free coffee, so we got people to think differently about loyalty and relationships in that world. It's why we've gone into convenience. It's why we're on motorways. It's why now we're putting in more hospitality, dining in our branches, so that we can move, hopefully, more quickly than everybody else to the new world. Because I don't think the old world of supermarket retailing can be relied on as a profit driver into the future. I think you have to think differently and creatively. So I have no advice. Oh, you're welcome.
Anybody else? We've got one at the back there. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mark. I'd like to thank you, first of all, and then ask you a favour. I'm a small supplier. My name is Brian Watt. We have a drinking chocolate called Hans Sloan. Very lucky we launched it and you listed it in 260 stores. And you let us sample in the stores in our area, which was fantastic. And it helped the brand to be successful. However, we pay 45 days to you, which nearly killed us. And I'd just like you to think about for small suppliers. I mean, Tesco's now moved to 14 days for a lot of small suppliers. If you could consider that, it could be really helpful for startup companies.
So we have a range of options. So we do have some of our primary producers that we pay in 7 days, and then we have some which go out for longer. So as part of the negotiation, the discussions that our suppliers have, part of it is around how we help you with terms of trade. Some people will say we want more margin. Some people will say cash flow isn't an issue for us. We'll take longer and better margins. So I think that's in the discussions that people need to have. But you're right, what we tend to do, by and large, is say, look, these are our standard terms. What we know, and I don't know who else you supply, is that our terms are better in terms of payment than the market more generally. But if you are a small supplier and you need to have that conversation with us, we're really happy to have it. Do you want to come back?
I'll be really honest with you. As a small supplier, we didn't really have a negotiation. And that's part of the challenge, being small, because you're so far down the food chain. We submitted something, accepted, the terms were there. It's kind of a take it or leave it. Now, I'm not grumbling. You've been fantastic for us.
Good.
You know, the stores are great. The people we meet in your stores are just so helpful when we go to sampling it. So it's, and then I suppose I'm really asking for other startup companies. We're just to bite the bullet and go with it. But for some startups with great products, they might just fail because they just don't have the money to keep going when they have a successful product with you.
And how many shops are you in?
We're in 260.
Ooh, that's a lot.
It's a lot of stores, and it nearly killed us at the beginning, but we really worked at it because we were so happy to be in so many stores at once. It was completely different from what our plan was, but it's worked for us.
Yeah.
But it's just a thing that would, a lot of other entrepreneurs I talk to, it really hurts them as a business.
So we've got lots of suppliers that are very local. They're in 4 shops, 6 shops, and we're very aware of cash flow and issues. But if that's a particular challenge, then talk to the buyer. They have complete license to talk and say, okay, they're our standard terms, but how do we need to adjust it for you? What does it mean for us to grow together? Are you in any of our competitors?
We're in 160 Tesco.
Okay. And are their terms different?
Dave just kept his promise last week and changed us to 14 days.
Okay. And what were you before?
60.
Okay. So, I mean, it will be interesting to see how that works through. As I say, I don't know what Tesco have done, and thank you for sharing that with me. But, I mean, what we find is that we benchmark below all of our competitors in terms of trade. But we want a long-term sustainable business. I mean, we're not interested in a fast buck. I'll tell you, if you'll indulge me for a minute, if I've got time, I'll just tell you a story about milk to illustrate the point. As you know, milk 4 pints was £1.40-ish, £1.39, £1.40. The price was then crashed to £1. In the first instance, we didn't move our price. We kept it at £1.39, but we found that our volumes went down by 9%. And so we concluded that we should go down to £1. And we were motivated by our suppliers, and I'll explain that in a minute. I went to speak at a fair trade convention, and I was criticised, understandably, by some delegates for joining in the price war and for devaluing milk. And what I explained to them is that our 62 dairy farmers, which are dedicated to Waitrose, saw a 9% volume drop, and they couldn't sell that milk. And they certainly couldn't sell it for the price we were paying, which at the time was about 33 pence for a litre, and the market was paying about 21 pence for a litre. And so what we committed to our suppliers is we would continue to pay them 33 pence, and we would take the profit hit. It's one of the reasons that profits fell in the industry last year, because everybody was taking some of those hits. And what we're motivated by is a long-term relationship with the supplier. What tends to happen, and I'm not saying this has happened in your case, is a lot of people see Waitrose as the right place to launch their brand. And so they'll come in and they'll say, we love you, we want to work exclusively with you, and we're delighted for that, absolutely delighted. But then quite understandably, they'll say, well, we're going to supply Tesco now. And our competitors look what's on the shelf of Waitrose, they see what's going well, and they'll start approaching our competitors. And before long, what we found out with some brands is the terms that are then being given to our competitors are much better than the terms that were originally agreed with Waitrose. And I've always taken the view that I don't care about that. Those were the terms that we came into an agreement with somebody, and we are going to honour those. You're the first person, I have to say, in my 9 years, who's ever told me that one of our competitors was now offering something better than Waitrose. But thank you for doing that. I will take it away, and I will pick up with the buyer in the sense that they say they're moving to 15 days, and what does that mean? You can't say this publicly, but I'd also be interested to know what commitment they've asked of you in terms of margin, gross margin, overriders, bonuses. So for a private conversation between you and I on how things are shaping up. Okay. For those of you that are not involved in the food industry, my apologies for that
Thank you.
interchange.
So I think we've got time for just one more quick question.
A critic might say of Waitrose, if their business model is so good, why is it that they're still relatively small in the market vis-à-vis their competitors?
So, John, I heard your question earlier to Charles about his shirts. Is that right? Was that you asking the question about the shirts earlier on? And you didn't seem to have a concern that they weren't the biggest shirt manufacturer in the UK.
From the point of view of the supplier, I was looking at it from the point of view of the purchaser. For instance, it doesn't matter to me whether who I get, the size of the person who I'm buying from, providing what I'm getting is what I want. My question is based on looking at it from your perspective.
So we are not interested in being the biggest. So we're not consumed by having a 30% market share. I've never been a great believer that scale of that size gives you massive advantages. I think it can bring you disadvantage in terms of consistency, the ability to innovate, the ability to bring new product in. And therefore, for me, it's more about trying to be the best you can be rather than the biggest that you can be. We have what we describe as a monastic expansion policy. We only grow as quickly as we can develop our people to open a new shop and to integrate the culture. And I think culture is hugely important. We describe culture as the sediment of past transactions. People have to understand how we work. So we're not in a race for growth. I don't judge our success by are we bigger than Tesco or smaller than Tesco. I judge our success by do we have loyal employees? Do we have loyal customers? What's our profit as a percentage to sales? What's our return on invested capital? Those are things that are really important for our business about long-term sustainable growth. I suspect many of the brands that you love, and you gave it away with your question on shirts, are not the biggest brands. They're brands that stand for something, that do things perhaps in a more thoughtful and careful way. That's what we try to do. So I'm not in the least bit worried that Aldi overtook Waitrose in sales last year. They didn't take customers from Waitrose, they took them from everyone else. But it doesn't matter a jot to Waitrose if Aldi are a tiny bit bigger or a Co-op are a little bit better than that. What matters to us is that we have great businesses in about 340 locations in the UK with people who are committed to give the best possible service that we can.
Great.
You're welcome.
I think that's a pretty good place to finish up.
You're very welcome.
Well, thank you very much.